The HOA fined me $5,000 for trespassing on my lake. They thought a few metal signs could scare me off my own lake island. But the moment I saw private property hammered into my shoreline, I knew something bigger was coming. Doubt turned to tension, tension to anger, and one twist after another proved this fight wasn't just about land, but about truth that had slept for decades. Stick with me because what happened next shook the whole valley. If you've ever dealt with an HOA pushing their luck, drop a justice in the comments. And if you want more stories where the truth wins, hit subscribe and ride with me to the end. The first light of day filtered through the cabin's old pine-framed windows, the kind my dad built with his own hands back when the lake was nothing but a quiet patch of Montana wilderness. The boards creaked under my feet as I walked toward the porch, coffee steaming in the cold air. Morning mist hovered low across the water, turning the lake into a sheet of silver that shimmered every time a breeze brushed across its surface. It should have been peaceful. It usually was. But that morning something felt off, like the quiet had teeth. I stepped out onto the porch and nearly dropped my mug, across the shoreline of my own island, my father's island. Bright orange signs glared back at me like warning sirens. Private property, no trespassing, Willow Ridge HOA. Every 20 feet, one stood hammered into the ground. Metal stakes driven deep into soil I'd spent my childhood fishing, camping, and learning to map under my father's watchful eye. For a moment, I just stood there. Confusion hit first, a cold punch right in the chest. Then came the heat, anger rising quick and sharp. I walked down toward the dock, boots crunching in the frost-tipped grass, heart pounding like something alive was trying to claw out of me. A pontoon boat drifted near the shore, engine humming low. 4 figures stood aboard, bundled in expensive jackets that didn't match the ruggedness of the lake. At the front, wearing a bright red jacket that looked like it belonged in a luxury ski catalog, stood Bethany Reed, president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. Even from where I stood, I could see the smug smile she wore, like she'd been waiting for this moment. "Morning, Remy," she called, waving like this was some friendly neighborhood meet and greet. "We're just finishing up boundary enforcement for community water assets." "Boundary enforcement?" I yelled back, stepping onto the dock. "What the hell are those signs doing on my island?" Bethany glanced at the others. Jake Mercer, developer with more money than integrity, Lorna Fields, HOA secretary, and a new guy I didn't recognize carrying a clipboard like it was a badge of authority. They smirked at one another before Jake cupped his hands and shouted, "Your island? That's cute." Bethany lifted a laminated packet, flipping dramatically to the first page. Under Section 12B of Community Environmental Management Guidelines, this land falls under Willow Ridge jurisdiction. Meaning, she said, pointing a manicured finger toward me, you can't live here without HOA approval. A laugh escaped me, short, sharp, more disbelief than humor. "Bethany," I said, "my dad owned this land before your subdivision even existed." She shrugged. "Well, the community has decided that water assets fall under collective oversight now. We voted last quarter." I stepped off the dock and waded through the shallow water toward the nearest sign. The metal was still warm from drilling. Fresh earth clung to the stake. "You put these up this morning?" "Correct," she replied. "And since you are technically trespassing on HOA-managed land, you've already violated 2 rules." She signaled to the clipboard guy, who tore a slip from his pad and held it up like a parking citation. "This is your first official notice." He placed the paper under a small rock at the shoreline, like he thought I'd be too afraid to come get it. A bitter wind blew down the lake, carrying pine scent and cold spray. I clenched my jaw. My father had given me this island with one request: protect it. Don't let anyone take what's ours. He'd spent his life working water systems and old dam structures across Montana. He knew boundaries, legal, hydrological, ethical, and so did I. Yet here stood 4 people who had never paid taxes on this soil, claiming it. "Why are you so sure this island is yours?" I asked, voice low. "You've never maintained it, never surveyed it, never owned it. So how?" Jake cut me off. "Because the community does now. End of story." Bethany nodded, her smile sharp as glass. "And if you don't remove yourself, we'll escalate. You know how these things go." I stared at them. These people standing in their clean jackets and store-bought authority, trying to understand what gave them the confidence to waltz onto land they knew nothing about. But the way they looked at me wasn't uncertainty. It wasn't fear. It was certainty. Certainty that whatever paperwork they held backed them up. Certainty that whatever power they thought they had would be enough to bulldoze anyone in their way. Certainty that my father's island, my home, belonged to them now. The pontoon's engine revved, and Bethany called out, "Violation notice is delivered. Expect further action by end of week." They turned away, drifting back across the water as the orange signs glared at me through the morning mist. My fists tightened, my breath fogged. The cold lake wind carried their voices away, but the question they left behind stayed burning in my chest. Why were they so confident they owned land they'd never paid taxes on? And what exactly did they think they had that I didn't? The only thing I knew for sure as the boat disappeared around the bend was this: something wasn't right. And whatever it was, my father had warned me it would come one day. I just never expected it to look like this. The lake stayed quiet long after the HOA's pontoon disappeared from sight, but the silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like the whole shoreline was holding its breath, waiting for me to take the next step. I walked back toward the cabin with the violation slip crumpled in my fist, the metal signs glaring against the silver morning light like fresh scars on the land. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows and landed across my father's workbench, his maps, tools, and journals all neatly arranged, just like he'd left them. I set the violation slip on the table, right on top of a folded map that had faded creases from decades of use. For a long moment, I didn't touch anything. I just looked. Dad wasn't a dramatic man. He wasn't the type to leave riddles or warnings without reason. But a week before he passed, he'd told me, "One day someone will try to claim what's ours. When they do, trust the land and trust the truth." At the time, I thought grief was making him speak in circles. Now I wasn't so sure. I unrolled the old county plat he'd marked up years ago, tracing the outline of the lake, the island, the stone causeway connecting the two like a bridge the earth had built for itself. The ink had yellowed, but the boundary lines were clear, until they weren't. My finger paused. A small pencil note in Dad's handwriting pointed to the island's eastern edge. Actual boundary plus 3.7 m discrepancy. Verify. I frowned. I grabbed the newer county map tucked beneath the stack. The official one issued last year, when I filed the inheritance paperwork. Same lake, same island, same marks. But the lines, they didn't match Dad's map. Not even close. According to the county version, the HOA's lake management boundary extended farther than it ever had during my dad's lifetime. Their jurisdiction line cut right across the island's shoreline, exactly where they'd planted those bright orange signs this morning. I felt my pulse tighten. Dad's maps weren't sloppy. He'd surveyed dams, rivers, and waterways for half the state. If he said there was a discrepancy, there was a discrepancy. And if he'd written verify, it meant he already suspected something. I leaned closer, studying the ink. Beneath the penciled note was another line of text so faint I had to hold it to the window. Not an error, not accidental. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Before I could absorb it, A metal clang echoed behind me, something shifting on the shelf near the back of the boathouse doorway. I turned, heart still heavy from the morning, and stepped toward the source. Behind Dad's old toolbox, half covered in dust and cobwebs, sat a metal tube, thick, military style, the kind used for protecting documents from rain, time, and careless hands. A strip of masking tape was stuck around the middle of it, yellowed at the edges. Dad's handwriting again. Use only if they come for the lake. My breath stopped for a full second. I pulled the tube out slowly, its weight heavier than it looked. My hands trembled slightly as I twisted the cap. It didn't budge, not even a little. That meant Dad sealed it intentionally, which meant whatever was inside wasn't meant to be accessed lightly. I set it gently on the table and stared at it, feeling the first spark of something I hadn't felt since the HOA boat pulled away. Hope. Not loud or triumphant, just a quiet glimmer, like the first crack of sunrise over the mountains. I reached for the lock release mechanism when a soft knock sounded on the doorframe. Rough morning? I looked up to see Don Keller, my dad's old fishing buddy and nearest neighbor on the mainland, leaning against the post. His weathered face looked more worried than amused. He stepped inside, brushing lake mist off his coat. I saw the signs from across the water, he said. Bethany Reed was grinning like she just bought the whole valley. I gestured toward the tube. Don, did my dad ever mention anything about a boundary fight? Or the HOA coming after the lake? Don rubbed his jaw. Your father didn't trust that HOA for a long time. Never told me details, but he kept saying, one day they'll push too far. His eyes fell on the metal tube. Is that what I think it is? I don't know yet, I said honestly. But if Dad hid this, it means something big. He nodded gravely. You be careful, son. Folks like Bethany don't just push a little. They push until they take. After Don left, I sat back down, staring long and hard at the tube. My father had prepared something he'd believed I might need someday. The HOA was confident, too confident. Confident enough to plant signs on land they'd never owned. Confident enough to smirk as they handed me a violation notice on soil they had no right to touch, which meant they thought they had proof. But Dad had left his proof too. And if theirs was fake, his might just be the truth that ends this. I placed both hands on the tube, feeling its cold metal steady me. One deep breath later, I whispered to myself, All right, Dad, show me what you knew. I twisted the cap again, harder this time, and felt the first millimeter of give. The tube creaked. Something inside shifted. A new question hit me with the force of a storm rolling over the lake. What in the world did my father prepare for? The answer didn't come fast. Not in words, anyway. It came in the quiet. The kind of heavy silence that settles after something is disturbed that shouldn't have been. The metal tube sat on the workbench, cap loosened but not yet open, almost daring me to see what was inside. But before I could twist it off the rest of the way, the lake wind shifted. A low rumble drifted across the water, followed by a faint thud, then another, and another. I stepped outside, boots sinking into the cold mud along the shoreline. HOA trucks, 3 of them. They rolled down the gravel road on the mainland side, dust kicking up behind their tires like ghosts rising from the earth. Even from across the water, I recognized the lead truck, Jake Mercer's lifted silver pickup, the one he used to tour his future development projects. Behind him, a smaller trailer carried bundles of laminated signs and metal stakes. My jaw tightened. They weren't done, not by a long shot. As Jake stepped out, he waved across the water, a wide grin plastered on his face like he was greeting an old friend. Beside him, Bethany Reed strutted down the shoreline in a bright blue jacket that probably cost more than my first truck. 2 board members followed behind, each holding stacks of paperwork thick enough to choke a filing cabinet. I didn't wait for them to shout first. I called across the water. "You planning on turning my island into a billboard? You've put up enough signs already." Bethany cupped her hands around her mouth. "These are community notices, Remy, and you're already in violation of 3 of them." Jake chimed in with a theatrical sigh. "Tough break, man. Should have joined the HOA properly when you moved back. Would have saved you some trouble." I barked out a laugh I didn't feel. "I didn't join because this island isn't part of Willow Ridge. Never has been." Bethany held up a rolled document and let it unfurl dramatically, like she'd practiced the move in the mirror. "According to new environmental management designations, the lake and this island fall under shared community oversight. Meaning," she said, tapping the paper, "you're officially trespassing. Again." "I can't trespass on my own property." My voice echoed across the water, bouncing off the pines. Bethany exchanged a smug look with Lorna, the HOA secretary, and pointed at a freshly printed fine slip. "We're issuing a formal penalty of $5,000 for unauthorized occupation and interference with community resources." Anger flared hot in my chest. I stepped into my canoe, untied the rope, and began paddling fast toward the mainland. The water slapped against the sides, oar cutting through the morning silence. By the time I reached the shore, they were waiting. Jake leaned casually on his truck, arms crossed. "Look," he said, pretending to sound reasonable. "We've got big plans for this lake. New docks, rentals, maybe a restaurant right on the water. But we can't do any of that if you're holding the place hostage." "Holding it hostage?" I echoed. "This land belonged to my father long before any of you moved here." Bethany stepped forward. "That may be your story, Remy, but the community has documentation, and documentation beats stories." A chill crept up my spine, not from the cold, but from the certainty in her voice. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't bluffing. She thought she had proof. Behind her, neighbors I used to chat with, folks who'd once waved at me from their porches, avoided my eyes, packing up their cars and slipping away. My stomach sank. The quiet withdrawal told me everything. The HOA had gotten to them. Jake glanced toward the lake. "Look, we don't want trouble, but if you just cooperate, we can work something out. There's money in this lake, real money, and we'd hate for you to end up on the wrong side of this fight." There it was, the real motive. Not community, not environmental regulation. Profit. A gust of wind kicked up dust around our feet, rattling the laminated signs in their trailer. For a moment, everything felt frozen in place, me standing between my father's legacy and the people trying to rewrite it with paperwork and arrogance. A voice broke the tension. "Morning, folks." Sheriff Marcus Hale stepped out of his cruiser, hat low, expression unreadable. His boots crunched across the gravel as he approached us, hand resting on his belt. Not threatening, just steady. Bethany's confident smile twitched. "Sheriff, perfect timing. We're simply enforcing community regulations." Marcus held up a hand. "I'll hear everyone, one at a time." He turned to me. "Remy, something happen?" I gestured to the swarm of signs, the clipboard, the fine notice. "They're claiming my island isn't mine. They planted signs all over the shoreline and hit me with a $5,000 penalty." Marcus's gaze sharpened. "On your father's land?" Bethany cleared her throat. "Former land, Sheriff. New documentation outlines updated management boundaries." "Documentation?" Marcus repeated, voice careful. "Then you won't mind showing it." She hesitated. Too long. Jake stepped in. "Sheriff, this is all standard procedure. The board approved." Marcus cut him off. "I didn't ask what the board approved. I asked to see the documents." Bethany's shoulders stiffened. "You'll have them. Soon." Marcus's jaw flexed. "I'll expect that." He walked closer to me, lowering his voice. Remy, when your dad was alive, he kept records tighter than a courthouse ledger. If something's wrong, you'll find it. I nodded, swallowing the knot in my throat. Bethany snapped her fingers, signaling her group to retreat. We'll be in touch with formal updates. Expect another notice shortly. They loaded into their vehicles, engines growling, dust swirling up behind them as they sped off, leaving me standing alone with the sheriff and a growing sense of dread. Marcus gave me a steady look. They've pushed folks before. Didn't think they'd go after you. Not with your father's history on this land. Neither did I. You got anything that proves your ownership? I thought of the metal tube back in the cabin. Maybe, I said quietly, if I can open it. Marcus nodded. Then I'd do that sooner than later. As he drove off, the lake wind picked back up, carrying cold air and the faint metallic scent of the new signs across the water. I paddled back to the island, the cold biting at my hands, the violation slip heavy in my pocket. Inside the boathouse, the metal tube waited on the table exactly where I'd left it. I sat down, hands steadying despite the storm inside me. Enough hesitation, enough disbelief. If my father had left something to protect this island, it was time to see it. I twisted the cap. It slid open with a long, scraping sigh, like the release of a secret held too long. And for the first time all day, I felt something stronger than anger or fear, a sense of resolve. Because whatever my father hid inside that tube wasn't just for emergencies, it was for this moment. The cap finally loosened with a metallic groan, and when it slipped free, a faint scent of old paper and cedar oil drifted out, a smell I knew well. My father used cedar oil on anything he wanted preserved. It meant whatever he sealed inside had mattered to him, really mattered. I tilted the tube forward and out slid a rolled bundle wrapped in heavy waxed cloth. It landed on the table with a soft thump, heavier than it looked. My pulse kicked up. My fingers shook, not from fear, but from recognition. My dad's handwriting peeked out on the cloth's corner. For Remy. I unwrapped it slowly. Inside were 3 things. A set of survey-grade maps, older but precise. A packet of official water rights certificates dating back to 1953. And a sealed envelope, yellowed but crisp, with my name written in his engineering, straight handwriting. I stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. My father never wasted words, so the few he wrote mattered. Inside, on a single sheet of thick paper, were just 3 lines. The island is yours. The lakebed is yours. One day, someone will try to take it. Use the truth. A breath I didn't realize I'd been holding escaped me. My father wasn't guessing about what might happen. He'd known. He'd seen it coming long before Gamma and I returned, long before Bethany Reed ever planted her first HOA sign into the ground. The maps were next. I spread them across the table, the corners curling like they were stretching after a long sleep. They were dated 1961 through 1982, years my father had worked as a water infrastructure engineer, the kind of work where precision wasn't just helpful, but required. And each map had markings I'd never seen before. Annotations in the margins, measurements down to the centimeter, small circles indicating buried survey markers. Most importantly, the island outline, the one the current HOA map claimed was part of community lake management territory, was nowhere near Supamor, the HOA boundary line shown on my father's maps. His measurements placed the boundary several meters farther out in the water. The discrepancy aligned perfectly with the pencil note I found earlier. And then something else caught my eye. Tucked beneath the maps was a small metal tag, the kind engineers use to mark long-term survey points. On it, etched in tiny letters, Causeway, private ownership confirmed, 1955 Federal Water Reserve allocation. My heartbeat quickened. private ownership of the causeway, which meant the walkway connecting the island to the mainland, the one the HOA routinely used as community access, was on my land. My father had known exactly what leverage that gave us. Just then, the wind rattled the thin cabin windows and carried a gust of lake-scented cold air through the room. The old map pages fluttered, revealing an envelope I hadn't noticed under the corner of the largest chart. This one wasn't addressed to me. It simply read, "If contested, show this to the attorney." Inside was a notarized copy of the original deed, complete with the federal amendments from the 1950s water project. It clearly stated that the lakebed and the land now hosting the causeway were kept in private ownership in perpetuity, exempt from later community development jurisdictions, meaning HOA's claims? Dead on arrival. I leaned back, stunned. For the first time since returning to the island, relief washed through me, warm, steadying, like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Dad had built more than a cabin here. He'd built a defense. And now it was mine to use. A soft knock sounded at the door. Before I could answer, Sarah Mitchell stepped inside like the cold wind pulled her through. Her dark hair was tucked into her collar, and she carried a briefcase that looked like it had seen more courtrooms than most lawyers twice her age. "Don called me," she said without preamble. "Said the HOA came at you hard this morning." She paused, eyes drifting to the spread of maps and papers. "Looks like you've been busy." I nodded. My father left more behind than old fishing gear. She approached the table slowly, her fingers brushing lightly over the maps. She knew quality when she saw it. "These are survey grade, military precision." She lifted one of the water rights certificates. "And this? Remy, this is federal, not county, documentation." "Exactly." She met my eyes, her expression shifting from curiosity to something sharp and calculating. "This could be game-changing. If the HOA thinks they can push you with fake boundary updates or intimidation, they already are," I cut in. "They hit me with a $5,000 fine. Jake practically told me to sell." Sarah exhaled slowly, the cabin lantern light catching in her eyes. "Then we don't wait for them to make the next move. We verify everything." She placed a hand on the largest map. "If your dad's measurements are correct, the HOA doesn't have jurisdiction anywhere near your property." The wind picked up again, whistling through cracks in the cabin walls, giving her words an eerie, prophetic weight. "So," she said, rolling up the map with practiced efficiency, "we start by calling in a federal survey verification." I froze mid-breath. "Federal?" "It's the only way to override whatever paperwork Bethany thinks she has. County maps can be wrong. HOA maps can be made up. But federal surveying?" Sarah gave a small, confident smile. "That's the gold standard. And if your father was right, they're about to learn just how wrong they've been." For the first time since the HOA signs went up, I felt something close to control settling over the chaos. Sarah continued, "I'll file the request today. They'll be here in a few days, maybe sooner. Meanwhile, don't confront the HOA again. They'll twist anything you say." I nodded, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. As she gathered the documents, she paused at the sealed letter from my father. "He knew what they'd try." "Yeah," I said softly. "He really did." Before she left, the last of the evening sun broke through the clouds, painting the lake in a deep gold that felt almost like a blessing. Sarah turned at the door. "Get some rest, Remy. This is far from over." But I couldn't rest. Not yet. Because the next move wasn't theirs. It was mine. And tomorrow, I'd be ready for whatever storm the HOA planned to bring. But the storm came sooner than that. By mid-morning, the air over the lake turned sharp and restless, cold wind rippling across the water and rattling the pine branches like bones. Gray clouds gathered faster than the weather report predicted. Never a good sign in Montana. I stepped onto the cabin porch with a mug of coffee warming my hands, trying to settle the weight of everything I'd uncovered the night before. That's when I heard it. Engines, multiple engines. A deep churn of boat motors echoed from the South Cove, followed by voices. Too many for a normal visit. I walked to the edge of the dock, and sure enough, a pontoon turned the corner, then another, and a third. And at the front of the lead pontoon stood Bethany Reed. Her bright jacket practically glowed against the clouded sky, and the smug wave she gave me from across the water made my stomach knot. Behind her were 3 other HOA board members, a man carrying a professional-grade video camera, and of course, Jake Mercer, grinning like this was a press conference he'd organized. They weren't here to talk. They were here to film. The boats glided toward the island with a precision that made it clear this wasn't spontaneous. This was coordinated, planned, and designed to make me look like the problem. Jake raised his hand in a mock-friendly salute. "Morning, Remy. You ready for your close-up?" The camera operator lifted the lens, zooming in on me. I straightened, jaw tight. "Recording won't change who owns this island," I shouted. Bethany's voice carried over the water like nails on metal. Actually, documentation is crucial in cases like these, especially when a resident is interfering with public lake access. "Resident?" I shot back. "I'm the owner." She ignored that, motioning toward the operator. "Get the shoreline. Make sure the signs are visible." Then louder. "You are currently obstructing community property, Mr. Cole." I stepped off the dock, boots sinking into the damp earth as I moved closer. "Community property? You mean the island my father owned for 60 years? Bethany folded her arms, expression hardening. "Mr. Cole, you've already received 1 violation notice. Continuing to occupy restricted land will result in further penalties and possible legal action." Jake chimed in. "Look, man, you're digging yourself into a hole here. Why don't you just come talk to us? There's opportunity here if you play ball." I didn't answer him, because something else was happening behind them. The second pontoon had shifted, revealing a car parked on the mainland dirt road, a familiar one. A dark gray SUV with a seal on the license plate. As the door opened, I felt relief wash through me. Sarah Mitchell stepped out, wind tugging at her coat, briefcase in hand, and she wasn't alone. Sheriff Marcus Hale walked beside her, his posture firm, lips pressed into a thin line. They'd come. Sarah made her way down the shoreline like she owned it, stopping right where the causeway reached the mainland. She looked over the lake, at the 3 pontoons, then directly at me. "You weren't kidding," she muttered under her breath as I paddled across in my canoe. When I reached the mainland, she didn't wait a second. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she called out to Bethany, voice calm but cold enough to cut steel. Bethany's smile tightened. "We're collecting evidence for community management purposes." "Funny," Sarah replied, "because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're filming private property without consent." Jake scoffed. "There's nothing private here. It's all community shoreline." Sarah stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "Then you won't mind showing the official documents that grant the HOA authority over that island." Bethany hesitated, her expression flickering. "Those documents are being finalized." "Meaning they don't exist yet," Sarah said. Marcus stepped up beside her. "Folks, I'll ask you to lower the camera. Until this dispute is sorted legally, you're on shaky ground claiming jurisdiction." The cameraman shifted uneasily, lowering the lens a fraction. Bethany tried to recover. "Sheriff, we're simply doing our due diligence." "And I'm doing mine," Marcus replied. "Show us the paperwork proving community ownership, or stop acting like you have it." Silence. Finally, Jake adjusted his ball cap and muttered, "This is a waste of time." Sarah turned to me. Remy, you have the maps? I lifted the roll under my arm. The originals, from my father. Her eyes flicked with satisfaction. Then we're not letting them bully you another inch. The boats floated awkwardly, the HOA's confidence visibly cracking as their camera lost its purpose. Sarah raised her voice so everyone could hear. We're filing for federal survey verification. Once completed, the results will override any local claims. If the HOA is in error, and I'm certain they are, you'll be liable for harassment, unauthorized signage placement, and boundary tampering. Bethany's face drained of color. Jake's smirk faltered. The cameraman stared at Sarah like she'd just pulled a sheriff's badge from her pocket. Marcus crossed his arms. You folks heard her. The lake grew still, eerily still, as the wind paused, leaving only the echo of Sarah's declaration hanging over the water. After a moment, Bethany snapped her fingers. We're done here. Back to the boats. She stepped on board, jaw clenched. Mr. Cole, expect further communication. Their departure was fast and messy, the three pontoons nearly colliding in their rush to leave. The camera operator dropped something in the water, a clipboard maybe, before scrambling aboard. When the last boat disappeared past the cove, the lake felt open again, wide, ours. Sarah let out a slow breath. Remy, they're scared. That's good. Marcus nodded. But scared people do stupid things. You stay sharp. I looked across the quiet water, at the orange signs fluttering in the rising wind. What had started as a violation notice had escalated into something far bigger. Bethany and her board weren't just pushing boundaries. They were building something, a plan, a scheme, a grab for control, and now they knew I wasn't backing down. Sarah closed her briefcase. Federal surveyors will be here within days. Once they arrive, this whole situation shifts. She gave me a firm look. Be ready. I nodded, because the storm hadn't passed. It had only changed direction, and this time it was headed straight at the HOA. By the next morning, the lake was unnervingly still, flat as polished glass, not a ripple out of place. Weather like that never sits right in Montana. The sky holds its breath, the birds go quiet, and the pines stand motionless, like they're waiting for something heavy to drop. I stepped out of the cabin, boots brushing through cold dew, listening to the distant echoes of the world waking up. But even the usual sounds, the whistle of wind through the trees, the soft splash of trout near the dock, felt muted. It was a silence that carried weight, the kind that comes just before a storm breaks something open. Sarah had driven back into town to coordinate the survey request, and Marcus was handling whatever fallout the HOA was brewing on their end. Meanwhile, I stayed on the island, sorting through my father's files, journals, and old tools. Not because I needed to, but because the waiting was worse than confrontation. In his basement workshop, low ceiling, single window half covered in frost, shelves lined with tools older than me, I felt closer to him than I had in years. His journals sat neatly stacked in a cedar chest. Their pages crackled as I opened the first one. March 12, 1978. HOA forming on the ridge. Good people now, but power changes, folks. June 4, 1985. Board proposing lake oversight. No authority. Must monitor. October 23, 1992. Boundary survey incorrect on county file. Do not trust revised documents. They will come for the lake. Each entry was methodical, measured, the handwriting tight and steady. Dad wasn't a man who worried about unlikely things. If he wrote it down, it meant he'd tested, measured, verified. By the time I closed the journal, I understood the truth. My father hadn't been paranoid. He'd been preparing. I slid the journal aside and unrolled one of the larger survey maps, anchoring the corners with wrenches. Dad's measurements were meticulous. Numbers, angles, locations of survey markers buried beneath the ground and lakebed. I ran a finger along the penciled circles indicating each marker. One stood out, a steel marker buried exactly beneath the start of the causeway. If Dad had placed one there, it meant he'd planned for the day someone questioned the boundary. It also meant the surveyors coming tomorrow could use that marker to confirm, down to the inch, who owned this land. I leaned back, exhaling slowly as tension twisted inside me. Dad had given me everything I needed. The only thing left was to endure the silence before the storm. Late afternoon, the wind picked up again, pushing ripples across the water. I walked outside, paper maps safely stored, and stood at the edge of the island. Across the lake, the HOA's subdivision glowed with late sunlight. Rows of manicured lawns, perfect driveways, homes built with identical precision. And right at the edge of the lake, bright orange signs still mocked me in the fading light. Private property. No trespassing. HOA enforced. Even from here, they were visible, designed to intimidate, intended to weaken my resolve. Instead, they strengthened it. As I stared, a figure moved along the opposite shoreline. Someone in a heavy coat, walking deliberately from sign to sign. When they stepped into clearer view, my jaw tightened. Jake Mercer. He paced along the water, talking on the phone, gesturing at the signs like he was showcasing a construction site. At one point, he kicked at a stake, checking if it held firm. The man never looked at the lake, never looked at the sky, just focused on plans, control, development. His world was straight lines, profits, and paperwork. But this lake wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a legacy. The sun dipped behind the ridge, shadows stretching long across the water. Jake finally walked off, leaving the signs as neon-colored scars on the land. I headed back into the cabin, lit the lantern hanging above the workbench, and spread out Dad's last sealed envelope, the only thing I hadn't opened yet. My hands rested on it for a long time before I finally lifted the flap. Inside was a handwritten note, longer than the others. Remy, when they come, do not fight them with anger. Fight them with truth. Authority can bully, paper can deceive, but measurements speak louder than men. Trust the land, trust the markers, and trust yourself. Below the note was a copy of correspondence Dad had kept from the Federal Water Project in the 1950s. A letter stating clearly the lakebed allocation and ownership status. The final line hit me the hardest. If they move against you, the survey will save you. A knock rattled the cabin door just as I placed the letter down. My heart rose in my throat until a voice followed. It's just me. Don't shoot. I opened the door to see old Don Keller standing there, bundled against the chill, his weathered face marked with worry. You all right, Remy? He asked. Saw that HOA crowd near your place again earlier. Whole lake's buzzing. I'm fine, I said. For now. Don stepped inside, shaking off the cold. Rumor is they're holding an emergency board meeting tonight. Folks say they're pushing to block off lake access until this is settled. I set my jaw. They can't. They don't own any part of this. Doesn't matter, Don muttered. They'll act like they do until someone stops them. He glanced at the maps on the table, whistling low. Your father would have been proud. He knew this day could come. I nodded, throat tight. Surveyors arrive tomorrow morning. That'll make the difference, Don said softly. Truth always comes out when the land speaks. After he left, the cabin returned to silence. I sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the water, turning the lake into a sheet of pale silver. Tomorrow, everything would begin. Or end. Federal surveyors didn't deal in rumors or intimidation. They measured. They verified. They wrote the truth into the ground itself. And the HOA, they'd built their entire attack on the assumption that the truth would never surface. As the night deepened, I finally lay in bed, the old pine frame creaking beneath me. But sleep didn't come easily. Every gust of wind rattling the cabin felt like the storm inching closer. Every distant creak felt like the lake holding its breath. But when dawn finally pushed through the window, pale and steady, I rose with it. Because today, the land would speak, and the storm would finally break. Morning arrived cold and pale, the sun creeping over the mountains like it wasn't sure it wanted to be part of what was coming. Fog clung low over the lake, thick enough to swallow the shoreline, and the air smelled like wet pine and iron, a scent that always shows up before weather or truth. I stood on the dock with my hand deep in my coat pockets, watching the mist shift. Somewhere out in that white haze, the federal surveyors were making their way across the water. Their boat engine hummed like a slow heartbeat, steady and certain, not rushed, not intimidated, just coming to do what they do best, measure the land and write down the truth. Sarah arrived minutes later, boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. She carried a binder under one arm, and the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how this day was supposed to go. "Survey crew texted," she said. "They're 2 minutes out." I nodded, exhaling a cloud of steam. "The HOA?" "They know," she replied. Jake sent another email at 5 a.m., full of threats, fake codes, long words he can't spell. And Bethany? Rallying the troops. Expect all of them. As if summoned by her words, the fog shifted, and 3 pontoon boats emerged ghost-like from the white. Banners snapping in the wind, cameras mounted. The HOA board packed shoulder to shoulder, bundled in expensive coats and overpriced confidence. Bethany stood at the bow of the lead pontoon, wrapped in a deep purple jacket that contrasted sharply with the pale morning. Her expression was stiff, controlled, but her eyes were restless, darting between me, Sarah, and the approaching survey boat. Behind her, Jake Mercer leaned on the rail, arms crossed, smirk plastered on his face like he was waiting for a show. "Of course they'd bring an audience," Sarah muttered. I didn't answer, because at that moment, a 4th boat glided into view, sleek, dark, unmarked, except for the federal identification plate on the hull. 2 surveyors stood inside wearing orange vests and carrying equipment that looked far too advanced for anything the HOA had ever dreamed up. Authority arrived without theatrics. No raised voices, no banners, just a quiet certainty that made the lake feel smaller. The lead surveyor, an older man named Brennan, stepped onto my dock with practiced ease. His assistant, Keller, followed with a tall GPS mast and a waterproof case of instruments. "Mr. Cole," Brennan said, shaking my hand firmly, "we'll begin at the causeway marker. I understand your father placed original survey stakes." "He did," I replied. "His maps show exact coordinates." "Good." Brennan opened his case. "We'll verify everything." Sarah stepped forward. "Everything the HOA is claiming hinges on boundaries they never bothered to confirm. Once you run your measurements, those claims fall apart." Brennan simply nodded. He wasn't here for politics. He was here for precision. On the water, Bethany raised her voice. "I hope you'll note community management rights in your documentation. This island has been overseen by Willow Ridge for decades." Brennan didn't even look at her. "Ma'am, we verify physical boundaries, nothing more." Her smile faltered. Jake tried a different tactic. "Sheriff isn't here today, is he? Thought he'd come back you up, Remy." A voice drifted from behind us. "Don't worry, I'm here." Sheriff Marcus Hale stepped out from the trees, hat low, breath steaming. He gave the HOA a slow nod, the kind a man gives when he knows something they don't. "Let's get this done," Marcus said. "I don't like loose ends." Brennan led the group toward the causeway. Fog hovered just above the ground, swirling around the stones as he set the GPS mast in place. He punched a few commands into his device, waited for satellite calibration, then compared numbers between his screen and my father's map. His eyebrows lifted. Not much, but enough. "Interesting," he murmured. Keller was kneeling by the stones, brushing away dirt. "Sir? Found it." Everyone leaned in. A metal glint peeked from beneath the earth, a steel survey marker stamped with a federal code and the year 1955. Brennan tapped the numbers on his screen again. This marker is exactly where it should be, and according to this, the property line lies. He took a few steps forward, 3.6 meters east of the recorded county boundary. Jake stiffened. Bethany whispered, "That can't be right." Sarah folded her arms. "Oh, it's very right." Brennan continued the measurements, along the causeway, across the shoreline, around the perimeter. Every reading tightened the noose around the HOA's fabricated claims. Finally, Brennan stepped back, his breath fogging in the cold. "Mr. Cole," he said clearly, loud enough that the lake carried his voice to every pontoon boat. "The signs planted by the HOA are entirely on private land. Your private land." A gasp rippled across the water. Bethany looked like she'd swallowed a stone. Lorna covered her mouth. The cameraman lowered his lens slowly, unsure where to point it now. Jake's smirk vanished. Sarah exhaled, satisfied. There it is. Brennan wasn't done. Further, the causeway, and the land extending 40 meters beyond it, falls fully within the Cole property boundary. The county maps are incorrect. They'll be updated. Bethany's voice broke into a shrill pitch. "You can't be serious! We have decades of documented community use," Brennan replied without emotion. "Ma'am, usage does not override federal survey data." Jake stepped forward, fists clenched. "There's no way," Marcus cut him off. "Careful, Mercer." Silence settled heavy and complete. The fog began to lift, just enough to reveal the bright orange signs lining my shoreline, the ones the HOA had confidently hammered in. Except now, in the new morning light, they didn't look like markers of authority. They looked like evidence of trespass, evidence of fraud, evidence of a desperate grab for land that never belonged to them. I turned to Sarah. "Time to file it?" She gave a single nod. "Time to end this." I pulled the folded document from my coat. The legal notice my father never got the chance to use. The property access restriction notice. Not a threat. Not a warning. A legally binding barrier. The moment the survey results were signed, that notice would become the wall between my land and the HOA's arrogance. I held it steady in my hands as the boats sat motionless on the water, the board members staring in stunned silence. Because today, the land had spoken, and it chose the truth, my truth. The fog had barely lifted from the lake when the surveyors packed up their equipment, signed their preliminary findings, and headed back across the water. They worked quietly, efficient, steady, respectful men who understood the weight of land and legacy better than any HOA board member ever could. But as their boat disappeared beyond the tree line, the silence they left behind was different. It wasn't waiting for a storm anymore. It was the silence right after lightning strikes, charged, humming, electric. I stood on the causeway, gripping the property access restriction notice in my hand. My father's handwriting still rested on the envelope it came from. Steady, sure, built on decades of knowing the land and knowing the law. Now, the document inside was no longer just a precaution. It was a shield, a wall, a line no one could cross. Behind me, Sarah stepped forward, her coat snapping in the rising wind. "You ready to do this?" "As ready as I'll ever be." "Then let's end this." On the water, the HOA's 3 pontoon boats hovered awkwardly, still processing what had unfolded. The board members stood stiff and silent, Bethany with her lips pressed into a tight line, Jake pacing the deck like a caged animal, the cameraman unsure whether to film or hide the footage he already had. Their confidence was gone, replaced by something bitter, shaken, and unfamiliar to them. Accountability. Marcus walked up beside me, boots grinding on the gravel. "You want me there when you serve it?" "Yeah," I said. "Let's make this official." We stepped onto the dock as the HOA boats drifted closer. Bethany cupped her hands, calling out, "Mr. Cole, we need to discuss this." Sarah cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Discussion time is over." The boats came to a stop at the dock, engines idling in uneasy rhythm. I could see every strained expression, panic hidden behind stiff posture, denial hiding behind forced calm. They'd walked onto this lake with the arrogance of people who thought they owned everything they could see. Now they saw how wrong they were. Bethany tried again, smoothing her hair with shaky fingers. "There must be some misunderstanding. The survey can't supersede." Brennan's voice echoed from across the water, his boat still close enough for one last reminder. "It supersedes everything." She flinched. Jake stepped forward, attempting a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Look, Remy, maybe we can negotiate. You've made your point." "This isn't a point," I said, lifting the document. "It's the law." Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out an embossed envelope with the county seal. "As of this morning's verified federal survey results," she announced, voice steady and clear, "the HOA has no jurisdiction over Mr. Cole's island, lake bed, or the causeway." She handed me the notice. I faced the board. "Effective immediately, all HOA access to my land is prohibited." Their faces paled. I continued louder, letting the lake carry the words. "Any attempt to enter, post signs, film, intimidate, or enforce fabricated rules constitutes federal trespass, and Sheriff Hale will enforce that." Marcus nodded once. "You heard him." Bethany sputtered, "This is insane. You can't cut off community access." "I'm not cutting off anything," I said evenly. "You tried to claim land you never owned. You trespassed. You planted fraudulent signage. You violated my rights. This notice stops you from doing it again." She clenched the railing so hard her knuckles turned white. "You can't do this." Sarah's voice softened, not gentle, but final. "He isn't doing anything, Bethany. The boundaries have always been there. You're just not allowed to pretend anymore." The wind picked up, scattering ripples across the lake. A single orange sign the HOA planted last week broke loose from its stake and toppled into the water, bobbing like a bright, drowning lie. Jake slammed a fist against the railing. "You're going to regret this, Cole." Marcus stepped forward, jaw tightening. That sounded a lot like a threat. Jake backed off immediately, muttering under his breath. I unfolded the notice and read it aloud, letting each word hit the air like a hammer striking steel. "All representatives of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association are hereby prohibited from entering, accessing, or interfering with the property of Remy Cole, including, but not limited to the island, shoreline, lakebed, and causeway. Violation constitutes a federal offense punishable by law." When I finished, I placed the notice inside a clear waterproof sleeve and nailed it to a cedar post at the base of the causeway, right beside the marker my father buried decades ago. As the hammer struck the final nail, the sound echoed across the water, sharp, final, unmistakable. Bethany flinched like each hit struck her directly. Sarah crossed her arms. "You're done here." Bethany stood frozen, eyes darting between the notice, the post, the surveyor's departing boat, and the last remnants of authority slipping through her fingers. Jake whispered, "We should go." But Bethany stayed locked in place until the third hammer strike. Only then did she turn, rage and fear twisting her expression into something raw and small. "This isn't over," she spat. Sarah replied softly, "It is. You just don't know it yet." The HOA pontoons pulled away slowly, engines whining, leaving only the fading echo of their defeat behind. The lake grew still again, quiet, but not tense this time. Settled, balanced, honest. Marcus placed a hand on my shoulder. "Good work, Remy. That notice puts everything on record. Now what? I asked. Now, Sarah said, closing her briefcase with a click. The county will want to talk. And when they do, the HOA is going to have a very bad day. I looked at the cedar post, the notice gleaming inside its sleeve, the survey marker glinting beside it. For the first time since they put those signs on my island, I felt the ground beneath me settle. Not just physically, spiritually. The land was mine. The truth was mine. And now, legally and publicly, power was mine too. But the story wasn't finished. Because the storm wasn't over, it was heading straight for the courthouse. The next 48 hours moved like the buildup before a thunderclap. Slow, heavy, pulsing with pressure you could feel in your bones. The county summons arrived early the next morning, hand-delivered by a deputy who avoided eye contact, as if merely holding the envelope put him in the blast radius of whatever was coming. The hearing was set for noon. No delays, no extensions, no excuses. Sarah drove us into town in her dusty Suburban, the heater blowing warm air that smelled faintly of pine needles and old coffee. Outside, the sky was the color of steel, flat, cold, and waiting. The kind of sky Montana got right before something big happened. "You nervous?" she asked without looking over. "Only about what they'll try when they realize they've already lost." She smirked. "Good. Fearless makes my job easier." Marcus was already waiting out front when we pulled into the county building lot. He leaned against his patrol truck, arms crossed, hat pulled low. "They came in an hour ago. Whole HOA board. Brought 2 lawyers, 3 binders, and a chip on every shoulder." "Sounds like them," I muttered. "Jake looks like he hasn't slept. Bethany looks like she hasn't blinked." He paused, then added, "This is the end game, Remy. Be steady." "I will." Inside, the courthouse had the kind of stillness you only hear in government buildings. Floor polish, recycled air, and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. The hearing room was already full. Neighbors I barely knew lined the benches. A few whispered sympathetically when they saw me. Others avoided my eyes entirely. They were scared. Maybe not of me, but of what the truth might do to the community they relied on. Bethany sat front and center, posture rigid as a fence post, hands locked together on the table like she was holding on for dear life. Her lawyer, a sleek, sharp-jawed man with a silver tie, whispered to her rapidly, flipping through papers so fast the pages snapped. Jake sat behind them, jaw clenched, looking everywhere but at me. Cordelia dabbed her forehead with a tissue, and Prudence clutched a notebook like it was a life raft. When Sarah and I entered, the room dipped into an uneasy silence. The county mediator, Rebecca Morrison, stepped up to the podium, calm, poised, neutral as snowfall. "We are here to determine the legal boundaries surrounding Lake Hollow Ridge and the authority of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association concerning said land." Her gaze moved to me. "Mr. Cole, you may begin." Sarah rose first. Not hurried, not aggressive, just steady. She placed a single leather binder on the table, thin, neat, terrifying in its simplicity. "Your Honor, we submit federal survey results verified 3 days ago, establishing Mr. Cole's exclusive ownership of the island, the lakebed beneath it, and the access causeway." She paused. "We also submit the original water rights allocation from 1957, which the survey is based on." A ripple of murmurs broke through the room. Rebecca lifted a brow. "Water rights?" I stood. My father worked for the Water Infrastructure Bureau his whole career. He inherited the lake's entry point and causeway from his father, my grandfather, under a federal allocation made during the dam expansion project in the 50s. Sarah slid the documents forward. Rebecca examined them carefully. "These are legitimate, original, verified." The HOA lawyer rose like a rattlesnake disturbed. "Your Honor, established community use supersedes outdated technicalities. The HOA has maintained, improved, and managed the lake for decades. Sarah didn't even blink. On land they never owned. He scoffed. Community investment creates equity. At minimum, it establishes easement rights. Not when the access point is wrong, Sarah cut in soon, pulling a second set of papers. The county survey from 1983 was based on incorrect shoreline boundaries. The federal survey corrected the error. Every HOA assumption built on that error collapses with it. Rebecca's eyes sharpened. Show me. Sarah handed her the corrected survey report. The room held its breath as Rebecca traced the lines, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise to outright alarm. After a long moment, she whispered, "The causeway is entirely on Mr. Cole's land." Bethany rose so abruptly, her chair screeched across the floor. "That is impossible. We have photographs, records, years of proof." "Proof of using someone else's land," Sarah countered gently. "Not owning it." Bethany's jaw tightened. "We followed protocol." Marcus spoke from the side of the room. "No, you didn't. You never paid taxes on the causeway. You never recorded easements. You never requested permits from the county. You just acted like you owned it." The HOA lawyer tried again. "The community has rights, not when fraud is involved," Sarah said. A hush rolled across the courtroom. Sarah opened the last folder, my father's meticulous journal notes. "These records show decades of unauthorized HOA charges," she said. "Bogus maintenance claims, fake assessments, duplicate contractor bills, unapproved shoreline alterations, and payments funneling through a private management company owned by Mr. Mercer." Jake's head snapped up. "That's a lie. It's public record," Sarah said, sliding the bank statements forward. "Your company billed residents for lake improvements on land you had no authority to touch." Rebecca's gaze landed on Jake like a judge's gavel. His face drained. Bethany turned on him, whispering something fierce enough to redden her cheeks. "This," Rebecca said slowly, "is significant. I must rule within federal law." She cleared her throat. "The HOA's claims are void. Their authority over the lake is revoked. All signage, restrictions, and violations issued against Mr. Cole must be withdrawn immediately." A tremor of shock spread through the room. Rebecca continued, her voice gaining strength. "The court recognizes Mr. Cole as the sole legal owner of the island, the lake bed, and the causeway. Furthermore, the HOA is subject to immediate audit and compliance review." Cordelia dropped her pen. Prudence gasped. Jake buried his face in his hands. Bethany just crumpled. Rebecca looked at me. "Mr. Cole, do you have anything further to request?" I stepped forward, the cedar-scented air from the courtroom wood mingling with the paper in my hand. "Yes, ma'am," I said. "One request." The room leaned in. "I want access restored for the community, but legally, fairly, transparently, no more intimidation, just an agreement based on the truth." A stunned silence settled, followed by a murmur that felt like relief breaking through tired hearts. Rebecca nodded. "Then let that be the record." She struck the gavel. The HOA had collapsed. But the story wasn't over. Because the lake still had one more truth to speak. The courthouse emptied slowly, like folks were stepping out of a long, strange storm and weren't quite sure if the sky was safe yet. I walked out into the Montana sunlight with Sarah and Marcus beside me. The air felt different, lighter somehow, as if the lake itself had taken its first full breath in 40 years. Marcus clapped my shoulder. "You did good today, Remy. Not a lot of folks would have had the patience to fight that clean." I shook my head. "Dad did most of the fighting. I just finished the chapter he started." Sarah gave a small smile. "You honored him. And the community. That matters." We parted ways in the parking lot. Marcus headed back to his truck. Sarah returned a call from another client, and I stood there just a second longer, letting the courthouse doors thud shut behind me. Their echo rolled through me like distant thunder fading. It was done. Legally, officially, undeniably done. But the work wasn't finished. The following morning, I ferried myself back to the island, the soft chug of the old outboard motor breaking the morning silence. The lake looked calm, mirror-smooth and blue enough to swallow the sky. Pines along the shoreline swayed lazily in a light breeze, whispering like they'd been waiting to tell their own stories. As soon as my boots hit the shore, I saw them. The same metal HOA signs that had started all this, still staked along the waterline like rusted accusations. Bent from weather, mud-splattered, ugly reminders of the past. I took a long breath, tasting pine and lake mist. Then I got to work. One by one, I pulled the signs from the ground. The metal squealed, then gave way with a dull snap each time the posts loosened. I stacked them in a crooked pile near the dock. They didn't look powerful anymore. They looked small, insignificant. When the last one came free, I felt something inside me settle. Not triumph, something quieter, closer to peace. I carried a wooden post from the workshop, the one my father carved decades ago, and hammered it into the earth at the top of the causeway. The sound echoed across the still lake. 3 words were burned into the wood. Lake access, respect the land. Not a threat, not a warning, just a promise. By afternoon, boats began to drift toward the island one by one. First old Don from across the bay, holding a thermos and wearing a hat older than I was. Then the Thompsons, the family with the Labrador that barked at everything. Then 6 more, people who'd been silent for years under the HOA's rule. They tied up quietly, respectfully, waiting. Don approached with cautious steps. We wanted to say thank you for not cutting us off. I was never planning to, I said. I just needed things to be honest. A woman near the back wiped her eyes. We've been scared of that board for so long. You don't know what you just did for this place. I nodded. We're going to rebuild this the right way. Together. They stayed for hours, talking, listening, telling stories about the lake I'd never heard. Kids skipped stones. Adults sat on the dock, feet dangling over the water. Someone brought sandwiches. Someone else brought a radio. For the first time in decades, the lake felt like a community instead of a battleground. Near sunset, as the golden light poured across the water, Sarah arrived in her Suburban. She walked down the dock, heels clicking softly. It's beautiful, she said. It finally feels like it's ours, I replied. She nodded toward the causeway. Words spreading fast. The county wants to use your case as a model for lake governance reform. Apparently you started something bigger than you know. My dad started it, I said. I just didn't let them bury it. We stood in silence, watching the light dance across the lake he'd protected for so long. When the breeze rolled through the pines behind us, it sounded almost like approval. Bethany resigned this morning, Sarah added quietly. Jake skipped town. The rest of the board is stepping down. The HOA as they knew it is gone. I looked at the calm water, the reflection of the trees stretching long and peaceful. Good, I said, not with anger, not with gloating, just finality. Sarah smiled softly. So what's next for you? I looked out at the island, my father's cabin, the old workshop, the shoreline he walked for decades. The lake shimmered as if waiting for its next chapter. I'm going to take care of this place, I said, the way he meant it to be cared for. She nodded. Seems right. As twilight settled, the last families packed up their things and waved goodbye. Boats drifted away with soft puttering engines, leaving V-shaped ripples stretching across the fading gold of the water. When the final hull disappeared around the bend, the lake became still again. A quiet place. A good place. I stepped onto the dock, the boards creaking softly beneath me, and sat at the edge with my feet just above the water. The cool air carried the faint scent of cedar and the last warmth of the day. My father's old boat floated nearby, rocking gently against its line. A boat built with his hands. A boat that had seen storms, triumphs, and secrets. And now justice. I let my fingers trail across the surface of the water. Soft, cold, alive, just like the truth. Across the lake, the wooden sign I'd planted stood tall, silhouetted in the fading light. Simple. Honest. Everything this place deserved. The wind shifted, carrying the low rustle of pine needles and the distant call of a hawk. It felt like the land itself was exhaling. Justice wasn't won by force. It wasn't won by threats. It was won by precision, by patience, by truth carried across generations. And as the stars blinked awake one by one over the darkening Montana sky, I whispered the only words that felt right. Thanks, Dad. We finished it. The lake answered in a gentle lap against the dock. Quiet, steady, eternal. The storm was gone, and the land was finally at peace now. If you've ever stood your ground against someone who overstepped, drop a simple justice in the comments so I know I'm not alone out here. These stories aren't just about land. They're about dignity, patience, and doing what's right. And if you'd like to ride along for the next one, hit subscribe and stay with me on this trail.